Well, the space didn't just start with the establishment of the space. There is a prehistory, probably a very long prehistory concerning Yvonne and Athol and Brian and all those people who worked there who maybe not early on realized that they needed a place to perform and to say the things that they wanted to say without fear of censorship and so on. But the immediate prehistory of the space was a play called Orestes, based on the Greek characters, workshopped by Athol Fugard with Yvonne Bryceland and Wilson Dunster and Val Donald and a number of other characters. It was done upstairs in a space virtually, just a commercial room above in a business organization. I saw the play on the first night, and it didn't run very long, but it was a very difficult play. I didn't understand much of it, and I asked Athol afterwards. I'd seen a number of his plays already, Hello and Goodbye and People Are Living There, which were fairly simple and easy plays to understand. What is Orestes all about? I couldn't really understand it. And he was reluctant to explain anything. He said, well, it is whatever it is to you. You know, as painters often do when you say, what does the painting mean? They say, you know, what does it mean to you? That's what it means. But he could see that I really was puzzled, and so he relented, and he said, well, look, if you think of the alphabet, then Orestes is letter F maybe, or D, or whatever. And if you think of Hello and Goodbye, or the previous plays, or even his first play, you know, that's the letter A, this is the letter F, and so on. And I kind of half understood it, and only later when the space came along and I saw, and I was in the statements after an arrest under the Immorality Act, which I think was the next thing that he wrote, I began to understand that it was his work, a progression of his work, and that maybe then statements was letter G, and Sisri Bunzi and all the others, you know, H and I and J and K, whatever. Anyway, Brian, who was married to Yvonne Bryceland, who was in the play and was working very closely with Athol, after seeing Orestes, realized that there was need for a place, a space in which people like ourselves could perform and experiment without commercial restrictions and maybe even government restrictions and free from censorship and so on. And eventually in London somewhere, I think they went to a theatre called The Space there, and they thought, this is the sort of thing we've really got to do. And Brian came back and was talk, and everybody talked and said, yeah, we will do it, you know, but none of us ever thought that Brian would really stick his neck out, because he was doing pretty well as a photographer and so on. And he stuck his neck out. It was a foolish thing to do. I mean, in retrospect, it appears it wasn't. It was brilliant, but the business risks were awful. But he found a space, and the theatre was built, and by that stage I was involved as well. And you know, the stage was timbered together, and the first play we put on there was Statements After an Arrest under the Immorality Act. A very challenging title, you know, for those who had not lived in South Africa. The title really challenged the government. It attacked a law that was really one of the tenets of apartheid. The Immorality Act forbade sexual relationship, indeed any kind of relationship between black and white. And here we were doing a play about it, and obviously we were going to be critical. And so for me, as a white South African actor living fairly comfortably, very much aware of the apartheid system, of course, but earning some money, freelance monies from organizations like the South African Broadcasting Corporation, which, while not government-owned, was certainly in the control of the government. So a lot of us had to think about it, you know, but we now had to stand up and say, you know, this is who we are, and I was not newly married, but I had a growing family and fairly comfortable. I thought, you know, I could lose all this. They could, you know, I could get arrested, stuck in jail, which is not really my kind of scene. But many of us had to make that decision, and so on we went with this particular play, and very often on that stage at night, and because the theatre was right in the centre of town, I didn't have as many lines as Athol and Yvonne. far less in fact. So I had plenty of time to hear the police sirens approaching the theatre and thinking, if they stop, I'm probably going to be arrested, and we all will be. And just hoping that these sirens would continue and fade away into the night, which they always did. They never actually stopped for our play. They did for others. But those are sort of challenges the space gave a lot of people, opportunities to look into yourself, into your own life, to face the challenges, to face what was going on in this country. Statements was the first play, but the pressure never let up. It wasn't a political theatre. We were concerned with doing plays. If they were political, then they were political, but we did a lot of comedies. In fact, many of the comedies were very important ones. Peter Dirk Uys, who is now a very big name in South Africa, started there as he arrived there as an actor, and the freedom at the space was such that they could say to him, he'd written a small play, wanted to do it, and Brian said, well, do it, you know, and who's going to direct it? You direct it. And he did. It was called Faces on the Wall. It was a moderate success, but it gave him the inspiration to write many of his subsequent plays, some of which were very telling. And although comedies in a way, Paradise is Closing Down was an allusion to what was happening in South Africa. God's Forgotten, a vision of what would happen to South Africa if apartheid continued and so on. Those things grew in the space, and Athol himself developed, I think, was able to make political statements rather than the earlier, I wouldn't call this biographical stuff that he wrote, but more about people. Not that he abandoned it. His plays were always a mix of the personal things and the things that matter to human beings, with the whole apartheid thing, encased in the situation in which we were living. Athol had done political plays before. In fact, one of the first ones that was commercially shown and which gained some kind of public was a play called Blood Knot, about two brothers, one who is darker than the other. They have a white father and a black mother. The one has a whiter skin and is able to pass as a white. The other is a colored man, and their problems. So he'd already done a political play, but now with Statements was another of these. Statements was a workshop play. It was really written entirely by Athol, and we make no bones about that. But he arrived on the first day of rehearsal and 3 weeks away from the opening of this theatre. We didn't know then it was going to be an epoch-making theatre. You must understand, it was just an experiment in a small theatre. But anyway, he arrived on the first day, and with an account of I think it was a newspaper cutting or an account of a newspaper cutting in which a young white school teacher and in which a young white librarian and a colored school teacher were caught having a sexual relationship, and the statements that come out of that arrest and so on. That's what that play was about. Athol would arrive with that, we discussed it, and the next day he'd come with a couple of pages and we'd memorize those pages, and then infuriatingly he would then say, no, I don't like it, and whatever you'd memorize, he would just tear up the pages and start afresh. And so we did more than one play, really, a lot of it. Yvonne, who had the leading role, she really had a lot to learn. It wasn't so bad for me. Well, Statements opened the space. It set the tone of the space, because there were some who thought it was boring and others who thought it was thrilling. Looking back now, I mean, Statements are still around. The people who thought it was not worthwhile, I don't know if they still are, but anyway. The pressures that Statements applied, the space never let up. I mean, they were always pushing the sides of the envelope. not politically particularly. That happened to be, we were living in a country where there was this horrible apartheid regime in place, and so obviously it was going to inform a lot of our work. But the idea of the space was to perform theatre in a free atmosphere, and there were comedies, Peter Dick Ace's comedies, which I think I've mentioned, God's Forgotten, which was more than a comedy, a very serious piece written by Peter Dick Ace. Paradise is Closing Down, about South Africa. I mean, the title says it all, and so on. There were Fado farces. We did comedies, classical ones. We did rubbish. Lots of things failed. That was what the theatre was about, a place where you could fail. People were appalled sometimes at the rubbish they said you could put on, but we, right, so it closed after 3 or 4 days, and we went on to do other things. That was what that theatre was about. Later on came, well, to me, the most significant piece of theatre at the space, indeed, probably the most significant piece of theatre I've ever seen in my life. Another Fugard play. Again workshopped by Fugard and 2 very talented black actors, John Carney and Winston Ntshona. These had been, they had been members of a group called the Serpent Players in New Brighton in Port Elizabeth, and Athol had worked with them. It created problems for them sometimes because they had to explain to Winston and John Carney had to explain to their brothers, their comrades, why they were consorting with a white man. But anyway, they workshopped this play, and it was originally billed as an evening with Athol Fugard, Winston Ntshona, and John Carney. And it became, the title was finally, it eventually was shown under the title, Siswi Bunzi is Dead. And it was a play in which the 2 actors were able to express their frustrations and their absolute disgust at how they were being treated as numbers, as identity numbers and passbooks, and they didn't, their names were unimportant. During the run of the play, the audiences were almost as interesting as a 3rd member of the cast, if you like. And I watched that play every night of its entire run, which wasn't very long because it got closed down and opened again under the club. There were all sorts of loopholes that we had to look for. Siswi Bunzi is Dead means that there's a man called Siswi Bunzi who was found dead, and Winston, who was playing a character, was looking for work in the town, and under the pass laws he wasn't allowed to be in that town because his passbook said he had to be somewhere else. And so he stole this man's, or just appropriated the dead man's passbook and became, Siswi Bunzi. And part of the play was him confronting this audience, this liberal South African audience, because most of the audiences that came to see plays at the space tended to be on the liberal side. And, one can define that word in many ways, but anyway, they tended to be. And he would say to them, "What's your number?" And nobody in the audience, mostly white, in fact, almost totally white, could remember their identity number. All people had identity numbers, but nobody had to carry a passbook, not the whites. And if they'd be embarrassed and mutter their telephone numbers, no black man forgot his number. You could forget his name, but not his number. That was the sort of confrontation. It was such theatre, It was just, all of a sudden I realized, and people in that audience realized what these guys had to go through. It was communication, it was confrontation, and as I say, to me, it was the most wonderful piece of theatre that I've ever seen in my life. Fugard then worked again with the 2 of them, did a play called The Island, about 2 characters on Robben Island, prisoners there. We called it The Island. We couldn't say it was Robben Island because we would have been closed down immediately. I say we, I wasn't involved in that particular play, but I think about the space as we. And there were always things that Fugard particularly could bring, could shake you with, to make you think. In The Island, these 2 guys were working on the sand pits and eventually sand got into one guy's eye, or lime, which irritated his eye, and he thought he was going blind. And so on stage, John unzipped his fly and urinated into his hand and poured this urine into his friend's eye, because that was what the reality was. What he had to do, it wasn't to shock people or to make people think, oh gee, this is shocking. It was reality. Those plays were just incredible, and I don't believe they could have been done at any other place at that time. I could go on and on about this, but that was the sort of thing that we were doing. Plays were banned very often because they were nude or blasphemous, but the space survived and went on, and started in 1972, finished in the early 80s. It had gone through a transition by then, but the original space actually ran for about 7 or 8 years. And by then, I think it had broken down the apartheid barriers. Shortly after that, anybody could go to any play, black, white, sit together, or go to the movies together, which just wasn't a reality before. That's unbelievable, but that's the way it was. And that's what the space did. And it also rocketed into international theatre. Just about everybody in the world started knowing who Athol Fugard was and what the space was and who they were. And people like Richard E. Grant, now big in the movies, started the space. Yes, he did in his early days. He was there. Henry Goodman, also now working in movies and in a big name in British drama. He was at the space. Yvonne Bryceland herself, who was a star at the National Theatre. Athol, whose plays are everywhere. John Carney and Winston Chona, who won Tony Awards for Sisri Bunzi and the Island. I can't think of any other theatre or any other institution that did as much as the space did in those short 7 or 8 years to change lives, change theatre, change attitudes, bridging gaps between blacks and whites. I think the instrumental in breaking down many of the apartheid barriers, particularly in the theatre. 25 years on, at a space celebration, a lot of space people got together. The emotion was incredible. It was as though the space was still in existence. Indeed, it was, at the end of the evening, you could be excused for thinking, well, this was just another night at the Space Theatre, and it was shared by many of those people. Athol Fugard believes, and I agree with him, that the Space Theatre provided the basis for the theatre in the new South Africa. And over and above that, I think that what happened to the space inspired many similar experimental theatres elsewhere in the world. When the space finished, work was carried on at the Market Theatre, because the space had fulfilled its function there. The Baxter Theatre in Cape Town started doing experimental plays. The Market Theatre with Barney Simon, who was also a great help with the space, took over from there, and other groups will take over from there. But the space age, if you like, the space experience was just phenomenal. And everybody who was involved with it, including, incidentally, Robert Patrick, who wrote and produced Kennedy's Children at the Space. Robert Patrick in New York was touched and moved by it. And I think if you had to talk to Robert Patrick, I think he would still remember the enthusiasm and the fire that he had, and the feeling that he had for the space way back when Kennedy's Children was done at the Space. Sisri Bunzi made us, whites, realize a lot of things we didn't think about. The fact that they had passbook numbers which were more important than their names. And Winston and John confronted that white audience, who were all liberals, I suppose. And Winston would, for example, go up to a white lady or a gentleman there and say, my number is 3472728. What's your number? And no white man ever knew what his identity number was. It wasn't necessary, he had a name. Making that kind of statement. The play opened with John Carney sitting on a chair, opening the day's newspaper and reading it aloud, and it gradually became obvious to us that almost nothing in that newspaper had any bearing on what was happening in their lives. The newspaper was about white people. You know, he'd say, well, air crash, 8 people killed. Well, he says, you know, the one thing we're sure of, you know, we're never going to get killed in the air, we can't afford to fly, that kind of stuff. It was just stunning. And there were confrontations. Earlier on, Winston would strip down to his underpants virtually, and he'd approach a woman sitting in the front row, maybe wearing a, you know, society lady, and just grab his genitals and say, "Look, am I not a man? Am I not a man like everybody else?" It was shocking, wonderful stuff, you know. Later, I think, I didn't see later productions in London, but I think he just, I think he even abandoned the underpants. It was, the audience, the South African audience, was part of that play. It was the third character. I went to that play every night. I looked at it every night, watching the different audiences. And I called everybody I could think of to say, see this, this is the best thing you'll ever see. This is something, this is a milestone. Of course, it got banned, it reappeared, but it was, Sizwe Bunzi may have died, the character, but the play, Sizwe Bunzi is dead, never died. You know, it's still around there, haunting us all. An astonishing play. Most people think of the space, of course, as Athol Fugard's theatre, which it wasn't. I mean, it was in its way, but he wasn't the only one. Athol is the one who is recognized internationally mostly. Brian Astbury was the one who started it, and Yvonne Bryceland, his wife. So it was Athol, Yvonne, and Brian really, you know, who started it all. I don't believe that Athol and Yvonne ever believed that Brian would do it, as I think he often tells you. But Yvonne was a remarkable woman, a remarkable actress. She was just, there was never a star thing about her. I worked with her long before the space, and I worked with her at the space, and she was just there was such truth, such integrity, you know, and it was so wonderful to play with her, and she did that. Everybody she worked with will tell you the same thing. It was just wonderful to get energy from her. She eventually had opportunities to go to London and could have made a big career for herself, but she kept on coming back to the space where she started. Eventually, she, when the space closed down in the late 70s, the original space, she did go to London, and she became a part of the National Theatre Company there, and became a big name. The funny thing about Yvonne is that way back, in the 50s, I did a play with Yvonne called Detective Story, in which the two of us were the leads. And working backstage somewhere, I cannot remember exactly in what capacity. He was a young guy. I think he was an assistant stage manager. I looked up the program the other day to see if his name was there, but his name wasn't even there, so he must have come in later. Who was a strange young man with his wife, who wrote one-act plays and wanted us to go and see these plays, and we did, and they were awful. And we all thought, well, you know, that guy's never going to get anywhere. That was Athol Fugard. He was there. I mean, he was part. In fact, he did. I think the first time he went on stage, may have been in Detective Story, because some guy didn't turn up, one actor didn't turn up one night, and Athol had to walk on dressed as a policeman and say a couple of lines. Maybe wrong. Maybe he'd worked before, but that's. Isn't that strange how Yvonne and Athol were actually working together long before? He'd forgotten about it, because long afterwards, Athol was having a drink with me somewhere, and I'd just seen a play, and I wasn't all that crazy about the actress he was using. I think it was Hello and Goodbye. And I mentioned as much, and he said, well, who the hell do you want me to do? Who can I use? And I said, you know, what about Yvonne? we imbibed quite a lot, and I wasn't even sure if it went into his head. But they did get together afterwards, and I was never sure whether it was that evening, that the thing clicked. And years afterwards, when Athol was now big and famous, I was in a bookshop, and I went Charing Cross Road somewhere, and so I saw a book on world dramatists. Athol was then considered, the leading British or English dramatist of the time. And I just flipped through the pages, and suddenly my name leaped at me, and I thought, what was this about? What am I doing in this book? And it was Athol who acknowledged the fact that I'd kind of suggested it that night, and that's how it started, which made me feel, well, just great.